So, Winter Wellness, week 8. We're here to talk about parenting. Jack Green, welcome to week 8.
Thank you, Rob. And before you say it, I don't have much experience in this, so this will be a Rob Stevenson session, one which would always be my favourite session anyway. I'm not sure parenting a dog would help very much. So, are you looking forward to leading this one?
Well, yeah, I'm looking forward to giving some perspectives. I mean, I think parenting is really interesting because when you first become a parent, you're just not prepared for it. There's nothing that can prepare you for it, and it is so life changing. And there is so much joy, but there's so much difficulty as well. And you kind of work it out, and you always feel like you're making it up as you go along. And and at each stage, my kids are kind of 9 and 6 now, which is in theory quite an easier age to deal with. They're much more independent, but it just brings up its own different challenges. But I think it's really interesting around the perspectives on well-being and mental health in relation to kids, and as we're being kind of more open now, how we communicate with them, how we try and help them with their kind of well-being. It's a fascinating topic, and obviously we've got a great expert speaker later in the week, haven't we?
Yes. So, Nikki Green, who also happens to be my mum, is one of the leading child wellbeing and behavioural specialists, and she's incredible at her job. And she's going to speak about emotional regulation and some other bits which she, provides to lots of people around the world. And yeah, very proud of what she does. But it's not just a case of she's my mum; she's actually really, really good. She's surprising me at how good she is sometimes. But the interesting thing I wanted to talk about with you, Rob, is the fact that obviously you've got your disorder, your bipolar disorder,
Yeah.
and it plays a big role in your life, and your children are a huge role. So how do you kind of communicate that and communicate that with them?
Yeah, thank you, Jacko. It's a good question. When I started being more open about my challenges of mental ill health and bipolar, I realised I needed to kind of be open with my children more. And we've always been pretty straightforward with them. When I'm in bed with depression, those times, sometimes, you know, that my kids would say, "What's wrong with Daddy?" And rather than just come up with an excuse, we'd say, "Well, Dad is, sometimes we're not very well with our minds as well as our bodies, and put it into language that they can understand." So they know. My daughter now knows about depression and bipolar. My little boy knows that sometimes daddy's head's not feeling too good. And so I think it's interesting because children don't have stigma. They don't, they it's not something that exists in their world. So if we're having a bad brain day, or our mind isn't feeling so good, they get that. It's just like their bodies don't feel good, or they've got a cold. So we've always tried to be more open. Since I've become a campaigner and mental health is my profession, then mental health becomes obviously a bit boring to them, so they don't really want to talk about it. But I think what's been really interesting is when I've developed the form score, the score out of 10, that's quite an easy way of communicating how we're all feeling. So I'll often, ask my daughter, "What's your score today?" She'll do the same. My little boy, he'll either be a 0 or a 10, depending if he's in a good mood or not. But again, that's a mode of communication as well. So it's actually been really interesting in terms of my development as a campaigner, how it's been easier to communicate how we're feeling amongst the sort of family group.
Yeah, and I think that's amazing, and it kind of brings in that simplicity of the form score, the fact that your children are able to use it, and that's what you want from something like that. We don't want mental health or well-being to be complicated, so I love the simplicity of it, and that's great. And you kind of touched on something I was going to ask, which is, you're very open, and we talk about leaders being open, that top of the hierarchy. If they share their stories, then it kind of trickles down. So you kind of touched on it, but in terms of your children and their emotions and how they communicate and their understanding, how has your experience and your openness kind of molded their kind of views on well-being and their own emotional regulation?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting one, and emotional regulation is a fantastic and fascinating topic. So for me, there's been a few things that resonate there. One, I think that the stereotype of how a male should behave, we've worked hard to challenge that. I remember my wife got this great book that we shared with my little boy, which was something that I can't remember what it's called, but superheroes have feelings too, and it was all about kind of these superhero type characters who were showing their emotion and crying. And I think it's been really important from a gender point of view to show our son that actually it is okay to cry. It is okay to express what you're feeling, and he does that. But on emotional regulation, I came across an author called Alison Knowles, who publishes a book called Ollie and His Superpowers, and it's a whole series of books. And I saw her give a talk actually to my kids' school, and it basically terms each feeling is a superpower. So sadness or happiness is a superpower, and they're kind of visualized by little versions of the person themselves. And then you can work on it, how you can make them bigger or smaller. So if it's sadness, you can try and squash that down a little bit and grow happiness, and how they all interact. And so again, with both my children, we've read that series of books and talked about how our feelings are part of us, but there are many different feelings, and then we have can not always perfectly, but the ability to control them. And that's been really cool, because I think coming through lockdown and the impact it's had on children's lives, which is significant. First we had the homeschooling, the stressed parents, the parents then putting their emotions onto their children. And as much as you try not to do that, if you're very stressed and trying to do your job and homeschool, that you are going to portray that, and that's going to impact your children in some way. So I think helping children kind of regulate emotions has been really important through these times. But I think it's also, again, to effectively parent, you've got to be able to regulate your own emotions and put your own oxygen mask on too. So we talk about this a lot, but it's getting back to the pillars of our own well-being and looking after ourselves. If we can do that, then we're better able to be better parents, I think.
Yeah, and exactly what you said there in terms of looking at yourself. That was the thing I was thinking then, being I don't have children. I'd look at this section and go, well, I might parent one day, but I'm not a parent at the moment. Maybe I don't need to listen to this bit. But actually what I've taken away from this is how we communicate with our children is actually a really good lesson for possibly how I could communicate with myself.
Yeah.
And how I could make things quite simple and bring that understanding and actually communicate to myself in that way, rather than trying to make everything bigger than it is. I think that would be a way I could possibly look at this and help myself.
It's a really interesting one, isn't it, Jack? And not to get too deep on this, but the smaller versions of ourselves, the little boy inside both of us that we carry around, and often that can be, if you've gone through any degree of therapy, can be linked to some of the challenge we have, with our mental health. Certainly, some of my depression can relate back to experiences and the way I view that little person that's kind of little Rob. But I think, again, if we can communicate to ourselves with kindness, being in the moment, as we've discussed before, with compassion, then that's a really helpful way of communicating, because we can be our own worst critic, can't we? And there can be that perfectionism kind of monotone that we've got going on. Whereas a bit of lightness, a bit of kindness, and communicating with ourselves in a positive way can be really helpful.
Yeah, when I was diagnosed with depression and anxiety and so on, I then went and lived with my best friend for a while, and my goddaughter at the time was just under a year, and it taught me so much about how happiness didn't require something to happen. I didn't need a stimulus as such, or I didn't need something materialistic to make me happy. And I understood that from watching her and seeing how happiness just comes and it goes, it's fleeting, it doesn't need something to push it. And that was a huge lesson for me. And then the other thing that this makes me think of is the fact that if you do have children, or you might work with children at some point, or nephews, nieces, whatever it might be, this is a fantastic chance when we're talking about stigma and changing the world. You're not going to change just that little child's life. If they understand well-being and emotional regulation, they're going to be able to change the whole world that we live in. So I think that's something really to think about.
Yeah, and I think my closing thoughts on this really, and this will be a short session because we've got the sort of expert coming up later in the week. But in all of my keynotes, I have this photograph of something Gabby, my daughter, drew for me, and I sat her down when she was 6 and said, "Can we have a conversation about mental health?" And she drew a little L above the M and wanted to talk about lentil health, and it was all quite funny. But I said, "How do we look after our lentil health?" And she said, "No accidents, wear your helmet on your bike." And then she said, "Think a lot," which is not always the right answer if we're experiencing anxiety. But then I asked her a specific question. I said, "Gabby, if you woke up one day and you were not feeling yourself and you were feeling sad, you didn't know why, you didn't want to get out of bed, you didn't want to play, what would you do?" And she looked at me like I was asking a really obvious question, Jack. And she said, "Daddy, I would find someone who I love and I would tell them, I would talk. Find someone who you love and tell them." And then I said, "If you went to school and you saw someone sitting off to the side and looking sad, withdrawn, not acting themselves, what would you do?" And she looked at me like I was an idiot. She said, "Daddy, I would go over and I'd see if they're okay. I'd ask if they're okay." And I use this in all of my talks because two things that we overcomplicate as adults in society. If we're struggling with our own feelings or mental health, find someone you trust or you love and talk, because as we know, talking is the start of that process to recovery. But in the workplace, when we see people every day, okay, we've got to look a bit harder right now if we're working remotely, but we see behavior change. If someone's not acting themselves, go and ask if they're okay and say, "Hey, I'm here for you. I'm available to listen." And I think children are great at just cutting through some of the BS that we put out there as adults, right?
Oh, so much so. And there's so many lessons that I can take away just from listening to you here, and hopefully help myself in the future and possibly then others in the future as well. So thank you for sharing that, Robert. It genuinely makes a big difference.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. And great to share a few perspectives as a parent. As I say, all parents, we're works in progress. We're trying our best, and it's one of the toughest jobs in the world, but one of the most rewarding. So I think the more we can be open with our children, the better. And as you say, the legacy will be stigma will not exist in the next generation, and that's something to strive for. So looking forward to hearing from your mum later in the week, Jack. I'll certainly be tuning into that one. And in the meantime, everyone, thanks for being with us. Week 8. This is going really fast now. So enjoy this week. Thank you so much.